Welcome back to the deep dive. It is Wednesday, February 25, 2026. I want you to take a second and just look at the date on your phone or your watch.
Yeah, we are almost 2 months into the new year now.
Right. And if you've been following the headlines even casually, you know that the world feels really heavy right now.
Heavy is probably the understatement of the year, honestly.
Exactly. But today, we aren't just reacting to the standard news cycle. We are dissecting a document that claims to actually explain why it feels this way.
And the source material we have in front of us today isn't your standard article or white paper. It is a blog post from a site called Kalkiism/Karmaism,
Right, and it's titled The Kalki Plan of Action.
which is quite a title.
It is.
Mm.
And honestly, when I first saw that title, I thought we were going to be reading some abstract philosophy or maybe a niche political manifesto.
But then you actually read the text.
Yeah, I started reading the actual text, and it reads less like a blog and more like a diagnostic manual for a patient that is critically ill.
That is a very apt comparison. It is essentially a systemic breakdown. The document is this relentless list of over 20 specific intersecting crises facing the South Asian region right now. So we are talking Nepal, India, Pakistan.
Right here in early 2026.
Mm.
But as we were discussing while prepping for this, you cannot look at this list and say, oh, these are just regional problems.
Not at all. This is very much a canary in the coal mine situation.
It's a case study for what sociologists and economists have been warning us about for years, right? The polycrisis.
Yes, the polycrisis.
Let's actually pause on that word for a second. Polycrisis. We hear it thrown around a lot lately. What does it actually mean in the specific context of this document?
So a standard crisis is one isolated thing going wrong. You have a bad harvest or a sudden stock market crash. You fix the isolated issue, you move on.
Right.
A polycrisis is when you have multiple major systems failing simultaneously. And this is the key part. They interact with each other to make the whole situation much worse than the sum of its parts.
Like a domino effect, but they're all falling on each other.
Exactly. You can't fix the economy because the environment is broken. You can't fix the environment because the political system is fractured. You can't fix the politics because the people are too sick or hungry to even engage. It is a massive tangle.
In this document, the Kalki Plan of Action is basically mapping out that tangle. It actually calls this period the age of volatility.
Or the lead up to a Gen Z revolution.
Yeah.
It sets a very specific scene. It argues that we are walking on an absolute knife's edge right now.
And what fascinates me is the structure of the source material itself. It presents this relentless, almost exhausting list of doom. Environmental collapse, health failure, war risk.
Yeah.
But then it has these sidebars.
The sidebars are wild.
They really are. These strange, fascinating links to things like Elon Musk's tweets about a post-currency future, and then spiritual prophecies about Kalki and the end of the age.
It is a jarring juxtaposition. You're reading about groundwater depletion and literal starvation, and then suddenly you are reading about a robotic utopia where money doesn't even exist.
It gave me whiplash. But I think that is exactly the point the author's trying to make. The source is suggesting that the old world is dying, which is the crisis list, and a new world is trying to be born, which is the Musk and Kalki stuff.
And the ultimate question it poses is, can we survive the transition?
That is the question of the hour. So here is our mission for this deep dive. We are going to do exactly what the source material asks us to do. We are going to connect the dots for you.
We are going to walk through these 25 points of failure.
Not just to depress everyone listening, but to see the actual system. We need to understand why you can't talk about civil war risk without first talking about melting ice.
Which means we have to start at the top. Literally at the top, the environment.
Section 1 in our breakdown is the environmental collapse. The source focuses heavily on what it calls the third pole. Now, I have heard this term before, referring to the Himalayas, but I don't think I ever grasped the sheer scale of it until unpacking this source.
The scale is massive. Outside of the North and South Poles, the Himalayan range holds the largest reserve of fresh water on planet Earth.
Wow.
It is the water tower for nearly 2 billion people. The source calls it a ticking clock hidden inside the mountains.
That specific image really stuck with me, a ticking clock. Because we usually think of climate change as this slow, gradual warming, a degree here, a degree there.
Right.
But the source describes something much more violent. It talks about a two-phase disaster regarding these glaciers.
Yes, and this is where the physics of the third pole gets truly terrifying. The first phase isn't drought. It is the exact opposite. It is deluge.
Because the ice is melting too fast.
Right. As temperatures rise, that ice melts rapidly. But it doesn't just trickle down peacefully into the streams. It forms these massive glacial lakes high up in the mountains. Eventually, the water pressure becomes too great, the natural ice and rock dams burst, and you get what is called a glacial lake outburst flood.
So massive flash floods.
Apocalyptic flash floods. We are talking about walls of water wiping out entire valleys, destroying hydroelectric dams, washing away critical bridges. The source explicitly points out that this destroys the very infrastructure we need to manage the water in the first place.
So first, you get way too much water all at once, violently destroying everything in its path.
And then comes phase two, the permanent drought.
Right, because the ice is gone.
Exactly. Once that ancient reserve of ice is gone, or even just significantly reduced, the savings account is essentially empty. The great rivers of the region, the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, these aren't just rain-fed rivers. They rely heavily on that slow glacial melt to keep flowing during the dry seasons.
If the glaciers shrink, the rivers shrink.
And the source calls this a geopolitical and humanitarian crisis in slow motion. Think about the geography we are dealing with here. You have Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. These are nuclear-armed neighbors who absolutely rely on the exact same rivers for their sheer survival.
If the water stops flowing across those borders, treaties just don't matter anymore. Desperation takes over completely.
Which leads us directly to the next point in the diagnostic: river drying and water toxicity.
Yeah, the source describes the rivers turning from lifelines into lifeless channels of industrial discharge.
This is the double whammy the region is facing. You have less fresh water coming down from the mountains because of the glacial melt issue we just talked about, but you still have the exact same amount of cities and factories along the banks pumping in sewage and industrial chemicals.
So the concentration of poison basically skyrockets.
It is basic chemistry. Dilution is the solution to pollution, as the old engineering saying goes, but if you remove the clean water volume, you lose the dilution effect. You are left with a concentrated sludge of heavy metals, microplastics, and completely untreated human waste.
The source mentions the communities are facing a double burden.
Yes, they are water scarce, meaning they literally don't have enough physical volume of water, but the water they do manage to find is highly toxic.
There is a line in the text that says, "A river's death is never sudden, it suffocates slowly, and so do the people who depend on it." That is just haunting.
It really is. And it has immediate, profound consequences for agriculture. If you are forced to irrigate your crops with that toxic water, those heavy metals end up in the rice, they end up in the wheat, and eventually they end up right on your plate.
Okay, so the surface water is either flooding you out or it is literal poison. So naturally, people look down, they look to the ground, which brings us to groundwater depletion.
Invisible crisis.
Right. You can stand on a bridge and physically see a river drying up. You cannot see an underground aquifer collapsing until your pump just sucks air.
The source uses an analogy here that I think anyone can understand perfectly. It says it is like spending from a savings account without ever making deposit.
That is the perfect way to visualize it.
Because these aquifers are ancient. They took thousands of years of slow rainfall to fill up, and we are draining them dry in a matter of decades. The source highlights that farmers are caught in a literal race to the bottom. They are digging deeper and deeper bore wells every single year.
Which costs a fortune.
Huge amounts of money and huge amounts of energy. You need significantly bigger pumps, which means more electricity or diesel, to pull water from 500 feet or 800 feet down.
And the source notes the quality issue here too. The deeper you go, the water quality often gets much worse. You hit pockets of naturally occurring arsenic or high levels of fluoride.
Exactly. And eventually, the account just hits zero. The pump runs dry.
And when it does, in a region where the surface water is also failing, you have a civilization-level threat on your hands. You simply cannot import enough water to grow wheat for nearly 2 billion people. It is logistically impossible.
Before we move on from the purely environmental section, we really have to talk about the climate disasters point. The source mentions untimely flood and drought.
What struck me there was this specific phrasing: erratic rainfall producing floods and droughts in the exact same year.
This is the volatility the author mentioned earlier. It is not just global warming, it is global weirding. The source describes a very realistic scenario where a farmer might lose their entire spring crop to a massive, completely unseasonal flood.
So their first harvest is ruined.
Right. Then they take out a loan, they replant, hoping to salvage the rest of the year, and the monsoon fails completely, leading to a severe drought that kills the second crop.
It destroys the fundamental ability to plan your life.
Precisely. Our entire human civilization, our planting calendars, our cultural festival dates, our urban construction schedules, it is all built on the core assumption that the climate is generally stable, that the heavy rains come in June, that October is relatively dry.
When that predictability vanishes, our systemic resilience collapses.
You can recover from one bad disaster. People are resilient. But can a family recover from 3 distinct catastrophic disasters in an 18-month period?
The source material strongly seems to think the answer is no. And that directly leads us to the human cost of all this. Because if the environment is the house we live in and the house is literally collapsing around us, the people inside are getting severely hurt. Let's move to section 2 of the diagnostic, the biological and health crisis.
This section is where the document gets intensely personal. It moves from the macro landscape down to the human lung.
First up is toxic urban air. The source specifies 10 months a year.
I really want to emphasize that duration for you. We often think of South Asian smog as a winter problem, crop burning season. The source is correcting that record aggressively. It is saying this is a chronic, year-round reality for hundreds of millions of people.
The cocktail it describes is brutal. Particulate matter, vehicular emissions, constant construction dust. It says living in these cities is equated to smoking multiple cigarettes a day without ever actually lighting one.
And that is not just a dramatic metaphor. That is based on the microscopic particulate matter, PM2.5, bypassing your lungs and entering your bloodstream directly. But notice how the source specifically highlights the massive impact on child development.
Yeah, it talks about lung health regardless of income bracket.
This is what economists call the hidden tax on the future. If a child breathes this toxic air from the day they are born, their lung capacity is permanently stunted. Their cognitive development is measurably impaired.
The source explicitly describes it as a silent epidemic.
We are raising an entire generation that is biologically compromised before they even enter the workforce. It doesn't matter if you are rich and have air purifiers, you still have to go outside eventually.
That is just terrifying. And while their immune systems are desperately fighting the air they breathe, they're also facing a brand new threat from the microbial world: antibiotic failure.
The post-antibiotic era. This is one of those concepts that sounds like dystopian science fiction, but the source presents it as a concrete, terrifying reality right now in 2026.
Explain this to me, because it sounds extreme. What does a post-antibiotic era actually look like in daily life?
It basically looks like the year 1920. It means that we have overused antibiotics so relentlessly, both in human medicine and especially in livestock farming, that bacteria have rapidly evolved to resist them completely. The source warns that common, everyday infections are becoming deadly again due to antimicrobial resistance.
So we're talking about a scrape on your knee.
A scrape on your knee from falling down, a routine dental surgery to remove a tooth, a C-section birth. All of these modern procedures rely entirely on the invisible safety net of antibiotics. If you remove that safety net, the risk profile of simply living your life goes through the absolute roof.
The source calls it a massive regression. It says medicine could be pushed backward by a full century.
It frames it perfectly as a collision between medical overconfidence and microbial evolution.
That is a very powerful phrase. We really thought we had permanently won the war against bacteria. The source is telling us we were completely wrong.
And while the medical system is busy fighting off these resistant superbugs, we are simultaneously dealing with a massive disease explosion from lifestyle factors.
Right, diabetes, blood pressure, high cholesterol.
The demographic shift here is highly critical. The source notes that these are no longer diseases of affluence. Traditionally, we thought of heart disease or type 2 diabetes as a problem for the rich urban executive who eats too much rich food and sits at a desk.
Right, a rich person's disease.
But now, these exact same diseases are absolutely ravaging the poor and working class populations. Why? Because the absolute cheapest food available is heavily processed, high sugar, high carbohydrate junk. Because the daily financial stress levels are completely off the charts. Because you literally cannot exercise outside when the air is equivalent to smoking a pack of cigarettes.
It calls it a silent epidemic eroding productivity and family savings.
And that right there is the direct economic link. If a daily wage laborer develops severe unmanaged diabetes, they physically cannot work as hard or as long, they lose critical daily income, then they have to spend what little they have to buy insulin, which costs a lot of money. It is a vicious poverty trap.
Which feeds directly into the mental health crisis outlined in the text.
The primary drivers listed by the source are just brutal: intense economic pressure, constant digital overload, and deep social isolation. And the negative feedback loop is undeniable here.
You're stressed about money, so your physical health deteriorates.
Right. You get sick, so you lose even more money. You're highly anxious about all of this, so you doom scroll on your phone for 3 hours, which only makes you significantly more anxious and isolated.
And the source specifically points out the deep cultural stigma attached to this. It notes that mental health remains critically underfunded and severely underdiagnosed in the region.
The author makes a brilliant point here. In a world defined by polycrisis, your emotional resilience is becoming just as critical to your actual survival as your physical health. But the public infrastructure to support that emotional resilience just isn't there at all.
And when you finally do collapse, whether that is mentally or physically, where do you actually go? Which brings us to healthcare overload and poverty death.
That specific phrase, poverty death, is incredibly chilling.
It is. The exact quote is, "Poverty transforms manageable conditions into death sentences."
Think deeply about what that actually means in practice. A manageable condition. Let's say a highly treatable bacterial infection or a severe asthma attack from the smog. If you have significant money, you go to a pristine private hospital. You get immediate oxygen, you get the absolute best new generation antibiotics, and you live.
You survive the polycrisis.
But if you are poor, you go to a public government hospital that the source describes as operating at 200% capacity. The doctors have been awake for 36 hours and are completely burnt out. The essential equipment is broken or missing. You might literally die simply waiting in the emergency room hallway.
So it is not that the medical cure doesn't exist in the world. It is simply that you cannot access it.
Exactly. Your basic biological survival becomes a strict function of your financial net worth, not the actual severity of your illness.
Okay, so we have a collapsing physical environment that is actively making people sick, and a fractured healthcare system that cannot catch them when they fall. Now, let's look at how these people are trying to just survive economically day to day. This is section 3, the economic breakdown. And I had to be honest with you, when I saw the first data point in this section, I did a massive double take.
You are looking at the food production statistic.
Yes. Food production collapse, negative 80%. Minus 80%. That sounds mathematically impossible to me. Sounds like a typo in the blog. Is the source intentionally exaggerating for dramatic effect here?
It is an absolute gut punch of a number, and I had the exact same initial reaction, total skepticism. But when you look closely at the convergence of all the factors we just discussed over the last 20 minutes, it starts to look significantly less like hyperbole and more like a terrifying mathematical certainty in a worst-case climate scenario.
Walk me through that math. How do you possibly get to a negative 80% yield?
You start by taking away the reliable irrigation water due to the glacier melt and the massive aquifer depletion. Then you add unprecedented extreme heat stress. We are talking about sustained daily temperatures so high that the actual pollen in the crops becomes completely sterile. The wheat plants might physically grow green leaves, but there is absolutely no grain in the head.
Wow.
Then you add the total soil degradation from decades of chemical fertilizer abuse.
So it's the perfect storm hitting the soil all at once.
It is. The source specifically cites soil degradation and extreme climate instability. If you physically cannot plant your seeds in May because your fields are buried under a flash flood, and what you do manage to plant in July dies of severe heat stroke or thirst, yes, you can absolutely see a systemic agricultural collapse of that unimaginable magnitude.
And the ripple effect of an 80% drop in staple crops. I mean, that is not just inflation or high prices at the grocery store. That is literal widespread famine.
That is an existential threat to the state. Severe hunger is fundamentally an issue of basic governance. If food production drops by even 30%, let alone 80%, local supply chains break completely. Desperate people migrate by the millions. It sparks immediate violent conflict. And the source explicitly reminds us, a massive crop failure in South Asia isn't just a local tragedy. It instantly destabilizes global food markets and shipping worldwide.
And the farmers themselves. The section on farmer distress is grim.
They are the absolute front line of this polycrisis. They are facing what the source accurately calls a multi-generational trap. They have been forced to take on massive, high-interest debt to buy expensive patented seeds, heavy chemical fertilizer, and to dig those 800-foot bore wells we talked about.
But the highly volatile climate means the actual harvest is a complete casino gamble every single season.
Precisely. And if they lose that climate gamble, if the rains fail, they still owe that massive financial debt to the moneylenders.
The source mentions tragic outcomes here. We all know what that refers to.
The epidemic of farmer suicides across the subcontinent. It is a desperate, deeply heartbreaking reality. The source strongly argues this isn't just bad individual luck. It is a total structural failure of the agricultural economy requiring massive, immediate policy reform.
But what about the hundreds of millions of people who aren't farmers? The young people crowding into the megacities? The document outlines a severe job crisis and unemployment trap.
It focuses on the youth bulge. Now, historically, economists have usually sold this demographic reality as a great thing, a demographic dividend. You have tens of millions of young, eager workers ready to power a booming manufacturing economy.
But the source vehemently disagrees. It says it is a massive systemic risk.
Because it is only a dividend if there are actually jobs for them to do. If there aren't any jobs, it is a ticking social time bomb. The source highlights a massive structural mismatch. We have millions of young people graduating with university degrees, but the theoretical skills they learn don't match what the actual modern market needs at all.
Or advanced AI and robotics automation have completely wiped out the entry-level corporate jobs they used to get right out of college.
Exactly. Their economic aspirations are rising exponentially faster than the actual available opportunities.
I really loved the specific line the author used here. Employment is described as dignity, not just income.
That is deeply profound. When you have an entire generation of smart, capable young men and women who feel completely useless to society, who have absolutely no path to basic human dignity or starting a family, that is exactly where deep social instability comes from. That is the exact fertile ground where historical revolutions are born.
And even if you do have a job, even if you consider yourself successful, if you are in the professional middle class, you aren't actually safe. The document details financial risk for the middle class.
The great middle class squeeze. The source describes small business owners and entrepreneurs facing endless regulatory uncertainty, massive inflation, and skyrocketing daily operating costs. But the key operative word the author uses is fragility.
A single disruption can wipe them out.
One bad event, a sudden new pandemic lockdown, an overnight government policy change, or a severe urban flood that destroys their shop. It can permanently wipe out 10 to 15 years of intense, grueling effort in a single afternoon.
Because the middle class is essentially forced to bear all of the systemic risk without any real government safety nets.
Correct. They are walking a very high, very thin tightrope without any net to catch them.
This leads us perfectly, though darkly, into Section 4, social fracture and urban decay. Because if the macroeconomy is financially squeezing you to death and the physical environment is literally poisoning your body, the social fabric naturally starts to tear apart.
Unrelenting human stress always finds a way out. Always.
The source talks extensively about urban chaos. It uses the phrase pressure cookers of inequality to describe the megacities.
It paints an incredibly vivid, stressful picture of the urban environment. Insane congestion, choking pollution, and the daily traffic. The source specifically calls the traffic wasted economic productivity.
It points out that it is not just personally annoying to sit in gridlock. It is systemically expensive.
We are talking about hundreds of millions of human hours completely lost every single week just sitting in idling cars breathing exhaust fumes. It chronically increases cortisol levels across the whole population. It dramatically increases urban road rage and casual violence. It is a daily, relentless grinding down of the collective human spirit.
And for the desperate families trying to somehow buy their way out of this trap, there is the education crisis.
The social mobility gap is widening rapidly. Public government institutions are explicitly described by the source as overcrowded, deeply underfunded, and fundamentally weak. Meanwhile, quality private educational institutions are utterly unaffordable for the vast majority of the population.
So the traditional ladder of social mobility is just gone. The cultural promise that if you simply study hard, you will automatically do better than your parents. That promise is completely broken in this polycrisis.
It is entirely broken.
And what happens inside the actual home when all these external pressures crash inward? The source gets very dark here. It talks about dowry death and domestic violence.
This is exactly where the severe economic pressure tragically mutates into fatal physical violence. Despite strict modern laws against the practice, the source bleakly notes that intense financial demands regarding dowry still frequently escalate into torture and death for young women.
And the author specifically links this ongoing tragedy to the broader economic situation we just discussed.
It does, very explicitly. It argues that you cannot just write this off as a backward cultural artifact. It is deeply systemic. When a family is facing total financial ruin due to job loss or crop failure, the deep-rooted gender inequality means the most vulnerable female members of the household are the ones who often pay the ultimate physical price for the family's stress. It is a horrifying, deeply disturbing downstream aspect of the polycrisis.
And the core family unit itself is clearly fracturing under the strain. The document points out an extremely growing divorce rate,
Which the source accurately attributes to a complicated mix of newfound economic independence for some women, violently crashing into the severe urban stress, and rapidly changing, confusing social norms of the volatility age. The traditional, rigid, patriarchal structures are simply buckling under the sheer, unprecedented weight of the year 2026.
And then, when people are angry, divorced, broke, and sick, we see the ultimate political distraction deployed: caste and religious conflict.
The source labels this the weaponization of identity, political polarization deliberately turning deep-seated religious and caste identity into a blunt instrument for control.
The document argues that this is the supreme tragedy of the current moment. Just when the entire society desperately needs to come together to somehow solve the catastrophic water crisis or the 80% food failure, they're intentionally being torn apart by hyper-polarized identity politics.
The author gives a very clear verdict on this. Societies aggressively divided against themselves physically cannot solve the massive collective challenges threatening their existence.
You cannot build a new water desalination plant or fix a melting glacier if you are actively fighting your neighbor in the street over a religious dispute.
Exactly. The polarization guarantees the polycrisis will win.
So, we have looked at the broken home, the chaotic city, the failing economy, and the toxic environment. Now, the diagnostic zooms out to the absolute widest possible lens. Section 5, geopolitical and existential risks.
This is where the regional South Asian crisis officially becomes a global nightmare scenario.
First is population pressure. The source calls its conclusion a clear verdict. Demography can be a total disaster if it is not carefully managed with massive education and smart policy.
It all comes right back to the brittle math of absolute scarcity. You have a rapidly growing, incredibly dense population violently colliding with rapidly shrinking finite resources like fresh water and arable topsoil.
And that mathematical collision directly leads to the risk of civil war for resources.
And notice the trigger the author identifies here is highly specific. It is not fundamentally about differing political ideologies or democratic ideals. It is sheer biology. Extreme scarcity of water and food combined with highly fragile, corrupt governance.
When people are literally watching their children starve and they have zero trust that the state will help them, they take matters into their own desperate hands.
The source warns us that massive civil instability doesn't just happen overnight. It slowly builds through what it calls deeply neglected warning signs. We are ignoring the warning signs right now.
And in this highly specific part of the world, domestic civil instability can very easily lead to something exponentially worse: the India-Pakistan nuclear war risk.
The source puts this existential threat front and center for a reason. This remains one of the most volatile, dangerous, heavily armed flashpoints on planet Earth. And in the direct context of the severe environmental collapse we mapped out, the entire strategic risk profile changes completely.
How so? Explain how the environment changes the nuclear math.
Well, traditionally, we think major wars start over contested territorial borders or deep ideological differences. But what happens if a war starts purely over drinking water? What if a major shared river physically dries up and one nuclear-armed country legitimately blames the other for aggressively damming it upstream?
That is an immediate existential threat. That is a fight for literal survival.
Exactly. And the specific risk factors the source highlights are terrifying. Severe miscalculation by desperate generals, and rampant digital misinformation.
Right. In the age of advanced generative AI and deepfakes, the traditional fog of war is thicker and more confusing than ever before. A highly convincing but entirely false intelligence report could easily trigger a panic, preemptive nuclear launch.
And the source reminds us of the global stakes here. Even a so-called limited regional nuclear exchange in South Asia would immediately throw enough soot into the stratosphere to cause a severe global nuclear winter, devastating agriculture worldwide.
So everyone on Earth would starve, not just the region, which deeply connects to the points on world war and cyber threats. The utter interconnectedness of the modern polycrisis.
The global economy is simply too tightly linked to ignore any of this. A massive state-sponsored cyber attack on a national power grid, a tense nuclear standoff in the high Himalayas. These aren't just sad local news stories you scroll past. They are massive global disruptive events that affect supply chains in London and New York.
Okay, I need to take a breath.
Yeah, it is incredibly heavy.
An overwhelming amount of information. We have just meticulously laid out a physical, economic, and social landscape that is absolute nightmare fuel. Environmental collapse, antibiotic failure, mass starvation, social violence, and the threat of nuclear winter. If this deep dive ended right here, I think you and I and everyone listening would just want to go crawl into a deep hole and give up.
It intentionally creates a feeling of total, suffocating hopelessness.
And this is a very, very big but. This is exactly where the source material and this deep dive gets really weird. And I mean genuinely, fascinatingly weird.
It takes a massive, unexpected turn.
The source material isn't actually just a depressing list of unsolvable problems. The title is The Kalki Plan of Action. And about halfway through the text, it completely pivots from this apocalyptic, grueling diagnostic to something that looks like, I don't even know how to classify it, science fiction meets ancient religious prophecy.
It rapidly moves from diagnosing the fatal disease to prescribing the radical cure. And the cure it suggests is truly paradigm shifting.
Let's start with the technology side of the cure. The source prominently links to a specific tweet from Elon Musk dated February 8, 2026.
Great, just a couple weeks ago.
I'm going to read this exact quote for you. Musk writes, "Once the solar energy generation to robot manufacturing to chip fabrication to AI loop is closed, conventional currency will just get in the way. Just wattage and tonnage will matter, not dollars."
Wattage and tonnage.
Help me out here. We literally just spent 4 or 5 minutes detailing millions of starving, indebted farmers, and highly toxic dying rivers. How on earth does a billionaire tweeting about AI robots help us solve any of that? It feels incredibly disconnected from the reality on the ground.
It feels like absolute intellectual whiplash at first, but here is the highly specific argument the source is actually making by including that quote. It is stating that the current global operating system, the traditional system of fiat money, manufactured scarcity, high-interest debt, the exact system that is actively driving those farmers to suicide, is completely obsolete. It is fundamentally broken beyond all repair.
So the argument is that you literally cannot fix the old economy.
You cannot fix it. You have to completely replace it from the ground up. Musk's tweet describes what he calls a closed loop. Imagine a fully automated economic system. You have massive solar panels, which provide effectively free, infinite energy once they are built. That free energy powers advanced humanoid robots. Those robots mine the raw materials. They build other robots. They build the microchips. And a super intelligent AI elegantly manages the entire supply chain.
So the physical labor is essentially free, and the electrical energy is essentially free.
Exactly. If the labor and the energy are practically free, the actual monetary cost of producing any physical good drops to near zero. Why do you need a bank loan and fiat currency to buy a farming tractor if an autonomous robot can simply build one for you for free using infinite sunlight and recycled scrap metal?
It is a radical vision of a post-scarcity society.
Yes. The source is brilliantly juxtaposing the negative 80% food production crisis, which represents the ultimate fatal failure of the scarcity model, with the promise of infinite robot manufacturing, which represents post-currency abundance. It is suggesting that the only possible way out of the deadly resource trap we are in is to forcefully leapfrog the current economy entirely and jump straight into this techno-utopia.
But advanced technology isn't actually enough to save us on its own, is it?
Yeah.
Because the author also brings in this entirely other dimension to the solution, the deep spiritual dimension, Kalkiism.
This is the critical second pillar of the proposed solution, the Kalki paradigm.
For those who might not know, who or what exactly is Kalki?
In traditional Hindu eschatology, Kalki is prophesied to be the 10th and final major incarnation of the god Vishnu. The prophecy states he will appear at the absolute darkest end of the Kali Yuga.
The Kali Yuga being the current age we live in.
Right. The Kali Yuga is the age of darkness, total moral vice, rampant corruption, and deep societal discord. Sound familiar based on our list? The prophecy says Kalki arrives to utterly destroy all systemic evil and globally restore Dharma, which means universal truth or cosmic moral order.
So the source is essentially framing all these massive modern crises, the microplastic pollution, the political corruption, the looming nuclear war, as the literal prophetic symptoms of the Kali Yuga finally coming to its violent end.
Precisely. It actively frames the polycrisis not as a random, unlucky series of unfortunate historical events, but as the painful, highly necessary death throes of an old, fundamentally corrupt age.
The plan of action references things like a Gen Z revolution and a great subcontinent uprising.
It strongly suggests that a technological fix alone will fail. The solution fundamentally requires what we might call a massive spiritual hardware update for humanity. There is a fascinating sidebar in the document titled Beyond Colonial Narratives. It talks extensively about totally rejecting modern economic slavery and mental colonization by strictly returning to foundational spiritual scripture.
So it is calling for a profound collective psychological shift.
It argues that to actually solve the desperate material crises of water and food, the entire region desperately needs to shed the imported colonial mindset, which it links directly to relentless natural exploitation and social division, and return to a unified spiritual framework that highly prioritizes deep cosmic justice and absolute truth.
So the grand synthesis the author is presenting here is really fascinating. The source suggests we need a massive, unprecedented technological shift. Musk's post-currency, robotic, closed-loop world combined with an equally massive, unprecedented spiritual shift, which is the Kalki restoration of Dharma.
It is the hardware and the software of an entirely new human civilization. The AI and the robots provide the infinite material abundance so we don't starve. But the Kalki spiritual framework provides the necessary moral software to ensure we actually use that godlike power wisely instead of just building more nuclear weapons.
It is suggesting that the ultimate solution to toxic drinking water isn't just inventing a slightly better chemical filter. It is a total, ground-up reimagining of how the human species actually lives on Earth.
It is a very ambitious, highly radical, almost millenarian vision of the future. But when you step back and look at the terrifying scale of the problems we mapped out, ancient glaciers vanishing, global nuclear war risk, total antibiotic failure, maybe a deeply radical, world-breaking vision, is actually the only thing that physically fits the massive scale of the crisis.
So bringing this all back down to Earth as we wrap up, what does all of this actually mean for you, the listener, for the person just driving to work right now, listening to this deep dive?
I think it means we all need to fundamentally change how we consume daily information. When you see a breaking news headline about a massive flood in Pakistan, or a severe red alert smog day in Delhi, or a violent farmer protest over debt, do not just see them as isolated pieces of depressing bad news anymore. See them as highly connected data points in this massive, painful, global transition.
The Kalki Plan serves as a harsh mirror. It forces us to see a deeply fragile world. It shows us that absolutely everything is connected to everything else.
And it poses an ultimate choice for humanity. The source deliberately juxtaposes the brutal reality of resource civil war with the utopian promise of post-currency abundance. It is directly asking us, are we simply witnessing the final chaotic breakdown of a dying world? Or are we actually experiencing the incredibly messy, painful birth pains of something completely new and beautiful?
It is a race, a desperate ticking clock race between the total collapse of the old corrupt systems and the arrival of the new abundance systems.
And the year 2027 is clearly the critical turning point of that race.
We're going to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought. The source material talks extensively about this futuristic closed loop where fiat money literally doesn't matter anymore. It talks about a massive region-wide spiritual revolution. I want you to just think about your own personal life for a minute. How much of your daily grinding stress, your deep anxiety, your biggest life decisions is entirely tied to the survival of these old world systems? The constant exhausting chase for dollars, the deep paralyzing fear of artificial scarcity.
And if those massive old world systems really are violently breaking down right outside your window, what exactly replaces them in your own daily life? If the external physical world is truly this volatile and dangerous, where do you personally find your internal unshakable stability?
Is your stability heavily invested in a digital bank account that is slowly being depleted by inflation and polycrisis? Or is it anchored in something much deeper, something that can actually survive the brutal transition to whatever comes next?
That is the ultimate question we all have to answer for ourselves very, very soon.
Thank you so much for joining us on this intense deep dive into the realities of the year 2026 and the implications of the Kalki Plan. It has been a really heavy one, but a critically important one to unpack. Keep paying attention, stay deeply curious, stay critical of the narratives you are fed, and keep connecting the dots out there. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye, everyone. Take care.